Over the course of 3 years, the Northwoods Model Railroad Club has created a model railroad display layout of the logging era of 1890 through 1910 for the Minocqua Museum Center. It includes the towns of Hazlehurst, Minocqua, Woodruff, Lac du Flambeau, and some of the smaller towns and villages in the area. Watch and listen as we take you back in time to the logging era of the late 1800s to early 1900s in the Northwoods. During this era, all of the trees in the Northwoods were cut down for the logging industry. Most of the cities, towns, and villages in northern Wisconsin were the result of the logging era. Many of these towns had sawmills and railroad access. There were only 2 mainline railroads that served the Lakeland area. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway built the line to Minocqua on its Valley Division. This railroad was commonly called the Milwaukee Road. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad went into receivership in March 1925, and in November 1926 it was sold at public auction to a syndicate, which formed the new Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad, which still was known as the Milwaukee Road. The other mainline railroad coming through the Lakeland area was the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, which ran through Woodruff. Actually, the railroad through Woodruff was built by the Milwaukee, Lake Shore, and Western Railway. That railroad was purchased by Chicago and Northwestern in 1891, but continued to be operated as the Milwaukee, Lake Shore, and Western Railway as a subsidiary until 1893, when the line was fully merged into the Chicago and Northwestern, and Lake Shore Railroad no longer existed. All aboard! Our first stop is Hazlehurst. Hazlehurst is known as the town that Yawkey built. Cyrus Yawkey probably first came to what would later become the village of Hazlehurst in 1888, which was after the railroad first started running trains to Minocqua. But the Yawkey sawmill was not built until the summer of 1889. There was no village of Hazlehurst until the sawmill was built, since it was purely a company town in its early years. Cyrus C. Yawkey began the Hazlehurst Mill with a partner, George W. Lee, and their firm was called the Yawkey and Lee Lumber Company. George Lee's interest was bought out by Cyrus C. Yawkey and William C. Yawkey in February 1893, at which time the firm became known as the Yawkey Lumber Company. In 1888, construction was begun on a line extending southeast from Hazlehurst. Although the railroad operations of the Yawkey Lumber Company were run under the name of the Lake Catherine and Southern Railroad, this early operation consisted entirely of narrow-gauge lines. It was in the fall of 1895 that a standard gauge track was laid from Hazlehurst to McNaughton. It was completed in December 1895, and it was known as the Hazlehurst and Southeastern Railroad. It first began running trains in January 1896. The purpose of the line to McNaughton was to provide a connection with the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad for the Yawkey Lumber Company, so they were no longer a captive customer of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. By 1900, the Yawkey Lumber Company was the biggest exporter of lumber products in the United States. In 1901, the Hazlehurst and Southeastern Railroad decided to build a new connection to the Chicago and Northwestern at Lake Tomahawk. This allowed them to abandon the much lengthier line to McNaughton. Do you know how Hazlehurst got its name? It is said that Mrs. C.C. Yawkey, upon stepping off the train in 1888, saw an abundance of hazel brush growing alongside the tracks. Thus came the name Hazel, and she added the Hurst, which in German means grove. All aboard! Our next stop is Minocqua. The village of Minocqua was born as soon as the railroad was completed to the island in December 1887, when buildings started to be built on the railroad property along the tracks. This became Minocqua's first main street, with saloons, hotels, and crude stores. In 1888, the village was served by the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. The Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western Railroad built a line from Rhinelander to Lac du Flambeau Indian Reservation in 1887 and 1888. Tree clearing for the line was completed by December of 1887. Track laying to Woodruff was completed in the summer of 1888. This then gave the village of Minocqua access to 2 railroads after 1888. Settlers were attracted by the fact that logging camps in the Minocqua area offered chances of employment, and the Minocqua area could now be reached by 2 railroads. All aboard! Next stop, Woodruff! The settlement of Woodruff coincided with the completion of the Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western Railroad to the area in the summer of 1888. By 1900, Woodruff was served by both the Chicago and Northwestern and the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroads. The Chicago and Northwestern tracks ran parallel to what is now known as Highway 47. A tower was located at the intersection of the 2 railroad lines. There were so many trains that passed through this area that the tower was manned 24 hours a day. They communicated mostly by telegraph, and once word was received that a train was coming, a switch had to be thrown, enabling the oncoming train to cross the other line's tracks. All aboard! Next stop, Lac du Flambeau. Lac du Flambeau was forever changed by the arrival of the train in 1889. The remaining 40 miles of track were built from the eastern edge of the reservation, Woodruff, to Hurley in the summer of 1889. Logging came to the Lac du Flambeau area in the winter of 1893 and 1894 with the construction of a sawmill. The sawmill was owned by the Lac du Flambeau Lumber Company. It began operation in April 1894. Lac du Flambeau, like Hazelhurst and Arbor Vitae, was a company town, although in the case of Lac du Flambeau, it existed in conjunction with the Indian village which was located there. For the next 20 years, 3 sawmills were in operation 7 days a week, and 8 to 10 railroad cars carried timber out each day. Logging and sawmill operations continued until 1913, when the logging was over and few trees remained. Do you know what Lac du Flambeau means? It means Lake of the Torches, which came from the French, who came to the area and saw the Ojibwe Indians spearing fish by torchlight at night. All aboard! Next stop, Lake Tomahawk. Lake Tomahawk in 1893 had a sawmill on the eastern shore of Tomahawk Lake. It was named the Lakeshore Lumber Company. The Lakeshore Lumber Company operated until 1904, when the large timber ran out. We hope you enjoyed your tour of the Northwoods, along with a little history of the logging era. If you have any questions, please feel free to speak with any of the museum volunteers. Thank you.